Wyoming Territory, 1878. The unforgiving frontier had claimed more souls than Grace Everett cared to count, and as she stood alone in the modest wooden church of Whispering Pines, her wedding dress catching the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sunlight, she feared it had claimed something else, her future. "He is not coming, Miss Everett," the Reverend said gently, closing his Bible with a soft thud that echoed through the empty pews. "I believe it would be best if everyone went home." The 20-year-old bride nodded numbly, golden blonde hair arranged in perfect curls beneath a veil that had traveled all the way from Boston. Her blue eyes remained dry, though her heart thundered painfully against her ribs. The few townsfolk who had gathered, mostly out of curiosity rather than genuine well-wishes, began shuffling out, whispering behind gloved hands. "Left at the altar by Edgar Harrison," one woman murmured. "What will become of her now?" Grace stood motionless, the delicate lace of her cream-colored gown suddenly feeling like a cage. She had convinced herself that love could flourish in this harsh territory, that marriage to the banker's son would provide security and respectability. Now she stood abandoned, her belief that she could forge a proper Eastern life in this untamed wilderness shattered like fine china dropped on Wyoming stone. "Miss Everett, would you like me to escort you to your boarding house?" the Reverend offered. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I would prefer a moment alone." When the church finally emptied, Grace sank into the front pew, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had come west 3 months ago as a schoolteacher, hoping to establish herself before returning east to the comforts of civilization. The frontier was no place for permanent roots, certainly not for a woman alone. It was a temporary stop, nothing more. Edgar had seemed her ticket to respectability, a stepping stone to something better. Now she had nothing, no husband, no security, and in a town this small, no dignity left either. Outside the church, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke her reverie. Vincent Dawson rode hard toward town, his chestnut mare kicking up dust behind them. At 25, he'd spent the last 7 years working cattle, first as a ranch hand and now as foreman at the Triple R. The harsh Wyoming elements had weathered his face just enough to give character to his handsome features, while his body remained lean and strong from daily physical labor. Unlike many cowboys who embraced the rougher aspects of frontier life, Vincent maintained a certain neatness. Today's stubble would be gone tomorrow morning, his dark brown hair was trimmed regularly, and while his clothes showed wear, they were always clean when he came to town. Vincent believed the frontier was no place for sentiment. Men who allowed themselves to get soft out here ended up dead or broken. He'd seen it time and again, cowboys who chased love instead of cattle, who built dreams instead of sturdy fence lines. The West required practicality, not poetry. He had learned to lock away softer emotions, keeping his focus on survival and building something tangible. The land had taught him harsh lessons about attachment. It gave nothing freely and took without mercy. Yet something had drawn him toward town today instead of finishing the fence repair on the north pasture. An inexplicable feeling he couldn't name had pulled him in this direction, past the usual saloon where cowboys gathered, toward the small white church at the edge of town. As Vincent approached, he was surprised to see folks dispersing, their expressions a mix of scandal and pity. Something had clearly happened. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post, and caught the arm of Tom Wilson, the blacksmith. "What's going on, Tom?" The larger man shook his head. "Harrison boy left that new schoolteacher waiting at the altar. Didn't even have the decency to show up and call it off proper, just sent a note saying he'd taken the morning stage east. Coward's way out." Vincent frowned. He'd seen the schoolteacher around town, hard not to notice her with that golden hair and those blue eyes that seemed to belong in a painting rather than this dusty frontier town. She'd always seemed so proper, too refined for Wyoming Territory. "She's still in there?" he asked, nodding toward the church. "Yep, wanted to be alone, can't blame her." "Humiliation like that?" Tom shook his head again and continued walking. Vincent stood uncertainly, one hand resting on his gun belt. This wasn't his business. The schoolteacher was nothing to him, just another Eastern transplant who'd learned the hard way that the frontier wasn't kind to delicate flowers. She'd likely pack up and return east now, another casualty of the West's harsh realities. But something kept him rooted in place, staring at the church door. He'd been raised with certain values before the frontier had hardened him. His mother would turn in her grave if he walked away from a woman in distress. With a resigned sigh, he removed his hat and stepped toward the church. Grace heard the door creak open but didn't turn. "Please leave me be, Reverend. I'll go shortly." "It's not the Reverend, ma'am," came a deep voice she didn't recognize. She turned then, hastily wiping away a single tear that had finally escaped. Standing in the shaft of sunlight from the open door was Vincent Dawson, the R foreman. She'd seen him in town occasionally but had never spoken to him. He was everything Edgar was not: tall, broad-shouldered, with capable hands and eyes that had seen the harsher side of life. The Cowboys represented everything she'd tried to avoid about frontier life: the wildness, the unpredictability, the dirt and danger. "Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged, quickly composing herself. "I'm afraid you've arrived at a wedding that isn't taking place." Vincent twisted his hat in his hands, feeling decidedly out of place. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry, Miss Everett." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It seems Mr. Harrison had second thoughts about our arrangement." "Arrangement?" The word slipped out before Vincent could stop it. Grace looked down at her gloved hands. "Yes, a practical match. Edgar wanted a respectable wife to help his banking career. I wanted—" She paused, suddenly reluctant to admit her plans to escape the frontier as soon as possible. "Security," Vincent finished for her, understanding dawning. He'd seen it before: Eastern women who couldn't handle frontier life, looking for any way out. Usually he felt nothing but disdain for such weakness, but something in her dignified posture as she sat alone in her wedding finery stirred an unexpected compassion. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Dawson," Grace said, misreading his expression. "I'm not offering pity, Miss Everett, just—" He hesitated, unsure what he was offering. "Maybe a ride back to your boarding house. Save you walking through town in your—" He gestured awkwardly at her wedding dress. Grace stared at him, then looked down at herself as though just remembering what she was wearing. The thought of walking through town, facing all those stares and whispers, made her stomach clench. "I would be grateful for that," she finally said. Vincent nodded and stepped back. "I'll wait outside while you gather your things." He retreated, closing the door behind him, and took a deep breath of fresh air. What was he doing? Getting involved in a woman's troubles was exactly the kind of entanglement he avoided. Yet here he was, offering assistance to the abandoned bride, a woman who clearly didn't belong in this territory any more than a rose belonged in a cattle pen. Inside, Grace quickly removed her veil and folded it carefully, tucking it into the small bag she'd brought containing a handkerchief and her mother's locket. There was nothing to be done about the dress. She would have to ride through town looking every bit the jilted bride. At least on horseback with Mr. Dawson it would be quicker, the stairs briefer. When she emerged from the church, Vincent was waiting, hat still in hand, his chestnut mare standing patiently nearby. "I'm afraid I didn't consider how you'll ride in that dress," he said, frowning at her voluminous skirts. "I can manage side saddle," Grace assured him, though the prospect of climbing onto a horse in her wedding gown seemed suddenly daunting. Vincent considered her for a moment, then nodded. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her. At her hesitant nod, he stepped forward and with surprising gentleness lifted her by the waist and set her side saddle on his mare. The unexpected contact, his strong hands at her waist, the ease with which he lifted her, sent a strange flutter through Grace's stomach. She adjusted her skirts as best she could while Vincent mounted behind her. "You'll have to hold on to me," he said matter-of-factly, reaching around her for the reins. Grace stiffened at his proximity but realized she had little choice. She placed one hand lightly on his arm, intensely aware of the impropriety of their position, a single woman in a wedding dress, riding with a cowboy she barely knew. But then she supposed being left at the altar had already shattered any pretense of propriety. As they rode slowly through town, Grace kept her head high despite feeling every curious stare burning into her back. Vincent remained silent, his body solid and steady behind her. For all his rough exterior, he handled her with unexpected care, keeping the horse at a gentle walk to avoid jostling her. They had almost reached her boarding house when disaster struck. Mrs. Larson's dog darted into the street, barking furiously at a passing wagon. The horse startled, rearing slightly. Vincent controlled the animal expertly, but Grace, unprepared for the sudden movement, lost her balance. She would have fallen if not for Vincent's arm swiftly encircling her waist, pulling her securely against his chest. "I've got you," he said, his voice low in her ear. For one suspended moment, Grace felt something she hadn't expected: safety. Not the cold security of a practical marriage, but something warmer, more immediate. The sensation was so foreign, so contradictory to everything she believed about frontier life, that she pulled away as soon as the horse settled. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she said stiffly as they reached the boarding house. "You've been most kind." Vincent dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Again, that strange flutter as his hands spanned her waist. He set her gently on her feet but didn't immediately step back. "Miss Everett," he said, something unreadable in his expression, "the West isn't always cruel." She met his gaze, surprised by the unexpected sentiment from a man who embodied the rugged frontier life she'd been so eager to escape. "Today's evidence suggests otherwise." "Today you lost something that wasn't real," Vincent replied quietly. "Sometimes the frontier strips away pretense, it's harsh but honest." Before Grace could respond to this surprising philosophy, Mrs. Haywood, the boarding house proprietor, burst through the front door. "Oh, my dear girl," she exclaimed, hurrying down the steps. "I've just heard. Come inside immediately. I've prepared tea." Vincent stepped back, replacing his hat. "Ma'am," he nodded to Grace, then turned to his horse. "Mr. Dawson," Grace called as he mounted, "thank you again." He touched the brim of his hat and rode away without another word, leaving Grace with the strange sense that something significant had shifted in her carefully ordered world. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Grace stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. Edgar's abandonment had been devastating, yes, but more to her pride than her heart, she realized. What truly unsettled her was the memory of strong arms keeping her from falling and dark eyes that seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade. Vincent Dawson represented everything she thought she didn't want: the untamed frontier life, the dirt and danger of the real West. Yet in her moment of humiliation, he had shown her more genuine respect than Edgar ever had. It was confusing. Grace turned on her side, forcing the thoughts away. It didn't matter. Once the scandal died down, she would save enough money to return east. This was still just a temporary stop in her journey, nothing more. The fact that a rough cowboy had momentarily made her doubt that conviction was merely a result of today's emotional upheaval. Meanwhile, Vincent sat on the porch of his small cabin at the Triple R, cleaning his revolver by lamplight and trying to understand why he couldn't get the schoolteacher out of his mind. Something about her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had struck a chord in him. Most Eastern women he'd encountered would have dissolved into hysterics or bitter recriminations. Grace Everett had faced her abandonment with the same stoic resilience he admired in seasoned frontiersmen. "Doesn't matter," he muttered to himself, sliding the clean revolver back into its holster. "She'll be gone soon enough." The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left him with an inexplicable hollowness that he quickly buried beneath practical concerns about tomorrow's work. 3 days later, Grace was in the schoolhouse after dismissing her students when she heard a commotion outside. Stepping to the window, she saw several men on horseback thundering into town, one slumped dangerously in his saddle. Even from a distance, she recognized Vincent supporting the injured man. Without thinking, she hurried outside, reaching the group just as they stopped outside the doctor's office. "What happened?" she asked as Vincent carefully lowered the injured ranch hand from his horse. Vincent glanced up, surprise flashing across his face at seeing her. "Snake got Jenkins while we were mending fence. Doc Peterson around. He left for the Anderson farm this morning. Mrs. Anderson's time has come," Grace replied, moving closer to examine the man's leg. An angry red wound was visible through the torn trousers, the flesh around it swollen and discolored. "Damn," Vincent muttered. "Sorry, miss," he added immediately. "Town's too far from the Andersons to fetch him back in time." Grace made a quick decision: bring him into the schoolhouse. "I can help." The cowboys exchanged skeptical glances, but Vincent nodded curtly. "Better than nothing. Thompson, ride out to the Anderson place anyway. Tell Doc we need him when he's done." Grace hurried ahead to clear books from a table as two men carried Jenkins into the schoolhouse. Her heart raced, but her movements remained steady and purposeful. I'll need hot water, clean clothes, and whiskey if you have it, she instructed, rolling up her sleeves. You know what you're doing, miss? Asked one of the cowboys doubtfully. My father was a doctor in Boston, Grace replied, examining the wound more closely. I assisted him often. It wasn't entirely true. Her father had indeed been a doctor, but she had only occasionally observed his work, never actively participated. Still, she had read his medical texts and possessed a better understanding than most. Vincent returned with the requested supplies, watching intently as Grace carefully cleaned the wound. The venom spread, but not too far, she observed. He's fortunate you got him to town quickly. Hold him down, please. As the cowboys restrained their friend, Grace took a deep breath, then made a precise incision to drain the wound. Jenkins cried out, struggling against the hands holding him. Talk to him, Grace instructed Vincent as she worked. Keep him distracted. Vincent leaned close to Jenkins' ear, speaking in a low, steady voice about cattle prices and an upcoming dance, anything to draw the man's attention from Grace's ministrations. His eyes, however, remained fixed on her hands, steady, precise, moving with unexpected confidence. After applying a poultice and bandaging the wound, Grace finally straightened, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. He needs rest now, and the doctor should examine him when he returns, but I believe he'll recover. The cowboys murmured their thanks, genuine respect in their eyes where skepticism had been before. As they arranged to transport Jenkins to the doctor's house to await Peterson's return, Vincent hung back. That was impressive, Miss Everett, he said quietly. Not many schoolteachers could handle a snakebite like that. Grace began washing her hands in the basin. I'm not entirely useless on the frontier, Mr. Dawson, despite what you might think. Vincent raised an eyebrow. I never said you were useless. You didn't have to say it. I've seen how men like you look at women like me, as if we're fragile ornaments with no practical value. Women like you, Vincent repeated. You mean educated, well-spoken. Eastern, Grace clarified, turning to face him. Too refined for the hardships of territory life. Vincent studied her for a moment, noting the strength in her posture despite the weariness in her eyes. I admit I had that impression at first. I'm reconsidering it now. Something in his tone made Grace's cheeks warm. She busied herself rearranging student papers. Well, even Eastern ornaments can have hidden depths, Mr. Dawson. The hint of humor in her voice surprised him. Indeed they can, Miss Everett. Indeed they can. He moved toward the door, then paused. The boys and I owe you for Jenkins. The ranch is having a small gathering Saturday next, nothing fancy, just a bit of music and food to mark the end of calving season. You'd be welcome to join us. The invitation caught Grace entirely off guard. Thank you, but I doubt I would fit in at a ranch gathering. After today, I think you'd fit in just fine, Vincent replied. Think about it. We'd be honored to have you. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Grace with the unsettling feeling that the barriers she'd carefully constructed between herself and frontier life were beginning to crumble. Saturday arrived clear and warm, a perfect late spring day in Wyoming Territory. Grace stood in front of her small mirror, adjusting the collar of her blue calico dress, her second best, neither too formal nor too plain. She still wasn't entirely sure why she had accepted Vincent's invitation. Perhaps it was the sincere respect in his voice when he'd extended it, or maybe she simply couldn't face another weekend alone in her room, hearing the whispers about poor Miss Everett whenever she ventured into town. The ride to the Triple R took nearly an hour, but Grace found herself enjoying the scenery. Wyoming in spring had a wild beauty that even she couldn't deny, rolling hills covered in new grass, wildflowers dotting the landscape, distant mountains still capped with snow. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected. A substantial main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings spread across a valley with a creek running through it. Horses and cattle grazed in nearby pastures, and the sounds of music and laughter drifted from behind the main house. As she approached, several cowboys nodded respectfully, and Jenkins himself hurried over to help her down from the rented mare. Miss Everett, right pleased you could come. Doc says you saved my leg with your quick work. I'm much obliged. Grace smiled, genuinely touched by his gratitude. How are you feeling, Mr. Jenkins? Right as rain now, thanks to you and Doc, he gestured toward the gathering. everyone's out back. Boss will be mighty glad to see you came." The boss in question appeared as if summoned, emerging from around the house with a tray of drinks. Vincent stopped short when he saw her, and for a moment something unguarded flashed across his face, surprise mingled with what looked remarkably like pleasure. "Miss Everett," he said, recovering quickly, "welcome to the Triple R." Grace was equally caught off guard. Away from town, Vincent seemed different, more at ease in his element. He'd traded his usual working clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest, his face freshly shaved. The transformation emphasized how handsome he truly was, a realization that sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Dawson. Your ranch is impressive." "Vince, are you bringing those drinks, or—" The ranch owner, Mr. Richards, appeared behind Vincent, breaking off when he spotted Grace. "Well now, you must be the schoolteacher who saved Jenkins. Welcome, Miss Everett. Come join us, we've got food, music, and the best view in the territory." The next few hours passed in a pleasant blur. Grace was introduced to ranch wives and cowboys alike, all treating her with unexpected warmth. The women especially seemed delighted to have a new face among them, eager to share stories and include her in their conversations. The food was simple but delicious, the music lively as several cowboys took turns with fiddle and harmonica. Throughout the afternoon, Grace found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Vincent. He moved easily among his men, respected without being distant, laughing and talking with natural authority. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the gathering, and each time that strange flutter returned to her stomach. As evening approached and lanterns were lit around the yard, the music slowed to more sentimental tunes. Couples began to dance in the cleared area near the musicians, and Grace watched with a wistful smile, tapping her foot to the rhythm. "Would you care to dance, Miss Everett?" She looked up to find Vincent standing before her, hand extended. Something in his expression, a mixture of confidence and vulnerability, made it impossible to refuse. "I would, thank you," she replied, placing her hand in his. Vincent led her to the edge of the dancing area, then turned to face her, one hand resting lightly at her waist, the other holding hers. The proper distance between them did nothing to diminish the awareness that crackled in the air between them as they began to move to the music. "I must confess, Mr. Dawson, I didn't expect such gallantry from a cowboy," Grace said, trying to dispel the tension with light conversation. The corner of Vincent's mouth quirked up. "My mother would haunt me if I forgot my manners, miss. She was determined I'd be a gentleman, frontier or no." "She succeeded," Grace replied sincerely. "Where is she now?" A shadow crossed his face. "Died of fever 5 years back. Pa followed a year later, pneumonia took him after a winter roundup." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "My parents are gone as well. Father 3 years ago, mother last spring." Vincent's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Is that why you came west, fresh start?" "Partly," Grace admitted, "and there were few positions for unmarried women in Boston that didn't involve factory work or servitude. Teaching out west offered independence, at least." "But not a permanent home," Vincent observed perceptively. Grace met his gaze, surprised by his insight. "No, I never intended to stay." "Wyoming is too," she gestured vaguely with their joined hands. "Wild," Vincent supplied, "dangerous." "Unpredictable," she decided. "In Boston, life follows certain patterns. Here, everything feels provisional, temporary." Vincent considered this as they moved together, his step surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his days on horseback. "The frontier changes daily," he agreed. "But there's freedom in that impermanence. Back east, your place is fixed by birth and circumstance. Out here, a person can become whatever they're capable of being." The conviction in his voice caught her attention. "Is that why you stayed?" "After your parents passed." He nodded slowly. "That and the land gets in your blood, hard to explain to someone who sees it as something to conquer rather than something to belong to." The music ended before Grace could respond to this unexpected philosophy. As Vincent released her, his fingers lingered briefly against hers, sending a warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the spring evening. "Miss Everett," called Mrs. Richards. "Come try this berry pie before these cowboys devour it all." With a small smile, Grace excused herself, aware of Vincent's eyes following her as she walked away. Something was happening between them, something neither had anticipated and neither was entirely comfortable with. She had come west believing men like Vincent Dawson represented everything she wanted to avoid about frontier life. Now she was beginning to wonder if perhaps they represented everything she had been missing. As the gathering wound down and stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Grace reluctantly prepared to leave. The ranch was too far from town to remain after dark. "I'll ride with you," Vincent said as she thanked Mrs. Richards for her hospitality. It wasn't a question, and Grace found she didn't mind his presumption. The thought of riding alone in the growing darkness was less appealing than she cared to admit. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional night bird calling. The moon rose large and bright, illuminating the trail and casting silver light across the landscape. "Thank you for today," Grace finally said. "I haven't enjoyed myself so much since." She paused, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so genuinely at ease. "Since coming west," Vincent suggested. "Perhaps longer," she admitted. "Boston society can be rather rigid." Vincent chuckled, and ranch gatherings are definitely not rigid. "No, but they have their own charm." She glanced at him in the moonlight, his profile strong against the star-studded sky. "Your people respect you greatly, that was evident today. They're good men, hard workers. And they follow your example," Grace observed. "I noticed how you were first to help with serving food, cleaning up. No task beneath you." Vincent shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "That's just ranch life, everyone pulls their weight." "It's more than that," Grace insisted. "It's leadership." They fell silent again until the lights of town appeared in the distance. As they approached the boarding house, Grace felt a strange reluctance to end the evening. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively. "Mrs. Haywood wouldn't mind." Vincent hesitated, clearly tempted, then shook his head. "Better not, town's got enough to gossip about without adding a cowboy calling on you after dark." The reminder of her status as the woman abandoned at the altar stung, but Grace nodded in understanding. "Of course." "How thoughtless of me." "Not thoughtless," Vincent corrected gently. "Kind, but your reputation's important in a small town, especially as the schoolteacher." He helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. In the silver moonlight, his eyes seemed to hold a question neither of them was ready to ask. "Good night, Miss Everett," he said finally, releasing her. "Good night, Mr. Dawson, and thank you again." As she watched him ride away, Grace was struck by the realization that for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she wasn't counting the days until she could leave. Instead, she found herself looking forward to the possibility of seeing Vincent Dawson again. The weeks that followed brought changes to Grace's carefully ordered existence. Vincent began appearing in town more frequently, sometimes with legitimate ranch business, other times with transparently flimsy excuses that fooled no one, least of all Grace herself. They developed a pattern of accidental meetings at the general store, the post office, after church services. Each encounter strengthened the connection between them, building a friendship unlike any Grace had known before. Vincent discovered that beneath her proper exterior, Grace possessed both a sharp wit and a genuine interest in learning about ranch life. She, in turn, found that the cowboy's rough exterior concealed a thoughtful mind and unexpected depths. He had educated himself through books ordered from back east, maintaining a small but impressive library in his cabin. Their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy to the practical challenges of frontier life. One sunny afternoon in early summer, Grace was supervising her students during their lunch break when Vincent rode up to the schoolhouse. The children immediately swarmed around him. He had become a favorite visitor, often bringing interesting objects from the ranch for their science lessons. "Mr. Dawson, did you bring us something?" called little Emma Wilson. Vincent grinned, dismounting with an exaggerated groan. "Can't a man visit without bringing presents every time?" The disappointed faces around him caused him to laugh. All right, I might have something." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out several large feathers. "Found these this morning, golden eagle feathers. Thought they might fit into your lesson about Wyoming birds, Miss Everett." Grace accepted the feathers with genuine pleasure. "They're perfect for tomorrow's natural science lesson, thank you." The children crowded around to examine the feathers until Grace shooed them back to their lunches. "What brings you to town today, Mr. Dawson?" she asked when they had a moment of relative privacy. "Two reasons," he replied. "First, to deliver those feathers. Second, to invite you on a picnic this Sunday after church. There's a spot by the creek on the ranch that's particularly nice this time of year." The invitation, delivered with casual confidence, brought a flush to Grace's cheeks. They had spent time together in town and at church socials, but always in public, always with others around. A picnic alone together suggested something more intentional, more personal. "That sounds lovely," she said after a brief hesitation, "but people will talk." Vincent's expression sobered. "They're already talking, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her. "The town's been watching us these past weeks," he continued. "Some approve, some don't. But hiding won't stop the gossip." Grace knew he was right. She had noticed the speculative glances, heard the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Mrs. Haywood had gently mentioned that while Vincent Dawson was well respected, a schoolteacher had to be particularly careful about her reputation. "I've never been one to care much what others think," Vincent added when she remained silent, "but if you'd rather not." "No," Grace interrupted, "I'd like to go Sunday after church." The brilliant smile that lit his face was worth whatever gossip might follow. As he mounted his horse to leave, Grace realized with startling clarity that somewhere along the way, her priorities had shifted. The opinion of Whispering Pines citizens mattered less to her now than the genuine connection she had found with this unexpected man. Sunday dawned clear and warm, perfect picnic weather. After church services, Grace changed from her Sunday best into a simpler blue calico dress, practical enough for a countryside outing yet still becoming. As promised, Vincent waited outside the boarding house with two horses, his own chestnut mare and a gentle gray gelding for Grace. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he helped her mount. The ride to the Triple R passed pleasantly, their conversation flowing easily between serious topics and light-hearted observations. Vincent pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days on the ranch, while Grace told him about her childhood in Boston and her journey west. The spot Vincent had chosen for their picnic was indeed beautiful, a grassy clearing beside a bubbling creek, shaded by cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled gently in the summer breeze. He spread a blanket on the ground while Grace unpacked the basket Mrs. Richards had prepared for them. "It's so peaceful here," Grace said as they settled to eat. "I can see why you love this land." Vincent nodded, looking out over the creek to the rolling hills beyond. "It speaks to something inside me. Always has from the first time I saw Wyoming Territory." "Even with all its hardships?" Grace asked. "The winters, the isolation, the dangers." "Maybe because of them, partly," Vincent replied thoughtfully. "There's something honest about a place that doesn't pretend to be easy. The frontier demands your best and punishes carelessness, but it's never malicious, just real." Grace considered this as she watched the play of sunlight through the leaves above them. "I've never thought of it that way. I've always seen the frontier as something to be endured, not embraced." "And now?" Vincent asked quietly. She met his gaze, feeling that same flutter that had become familiar whenever their eyes connected. "Now I'm beginning to see its appeal." After they finished eating, Vincent suggested a short walk along the creek. As they strolled side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, Grace felt a contentment she hadn't expected to find in Wyoming Territory. The rigid plans she'd made, teaching just long enough to save money for a return east, seemed increasingly distant, like memories from someone else's life. "What are you thinking about?" Vincent asked, noticing her pensive expression. "How different my life has become from what I imagined," she admitted. "When I first came west, I had everything mapped out. Teaching was merely a means to an end." "And now?" Grace stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Now I find myself reluctant to leave." The significance of her words hung in the air between them. Vincent took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," he said softly. What might have happened next remained unknown, for at that moment the peaceful afternoon was shattered by the sound of approaching riders. Vincent tensed, instinctively moving slightly in front of Grace as three men on horseback came into view around the bend in the creek. "Well, well," called the lead rider, a rough-looking man with a week's growth of beard. "What have we here?" Dawson taking a lady friend for a stroll. "Larson," Vincent acknowledged coldly. "You're on Triple R property." "Public creek access," the man called Larson retorted. "Besides, we're just passing through, on our way to business in town." Grace felt Vincent's posture shift subtly, his hand moving closer to the revolver at his hip. There was clearly history between these men, none of it good. "Then keep passing through," Vincent said evenly. "Nothing here concerns you." Larson's gaze shifted to Grace, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "Wait a minute, I know you. You're that schoolteacher, the one who got left at the altar." He laughed an ugly sound. "Moving up in the world, are you, from banker's son to cowboy?" Grace felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but before she could respond, Vincent took another step forward. "You're done here, Larson," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Ride on." Something in his tone must have penetrated even Larson's thick skull, for after a tense moment the man shrugged. "Just making conversation, come on boys. Our business won't wait." As they rode away, Vincent turned to Grace, concern evident in his expression. "I'm sorry about that. Jade Larson's trouble runs a small outfit north of here, but makes most of his money rustling cattle and selling whiskey to the reservations." "You have history with him," Grace observed. Vincent's jaw tightened. "He tried to steal Triple R cattle last winter. We caught him and his men red-handed. Should have gone to jail, but the territorial judge was snowed in for months. By the time he arrived, evidence had disappeared, and witnesses changed their stories. The encounter had cast a shadow over their perfect afternoon. As they walked back to their picnic site, Grace found herself wondering how many other dangerous men populated this territory, men against whom the thin veneer of civilization offered little protection. It was a stark reminder of why she had always believed the frontier was no place to put down roots. Vincent seemed to read her thoughts. "I shouldn't have brought you here," he said as they gathered their things. "I didn't think about Larson possibly riding through." "You couldn't have known," Grace assured him, "and I'm not made of glass, Vincent. An unpleasant encounter won't break me." The use of his first name slipped out naturally, and his expression softened at the sound of it. "No, you're certainly not made of glass. Still, I wanted today to be perfect." "It was perfect," she insisted, placing a hand on his arm. "A few minutes with an unpleasant man doesn't change that." Their eyes met and held, and for a breathless moment Grace thought Vincent might kiss her. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. "We should head back," he said reluctantly. Storm clouds building to the west. The ride back to town was quieter than their outward journey, both of them lost in thought about the encounter with Larson and the moment of connection that had followed. As they approached the boarding house, fat raindrops began to fall, the storm moving in faster than expected. They had just reached the porch when the sky opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Laughing, they hurried under the overhang, Vincent quickly tying the horses to the railing. "You're soaked," Grace observed, reaching up without thinking to brush wet hair from his forehead. Vincent caught her hand as she began to withdraw it, holding it gently against his cheek. The rain drummed on the porch roof, creating a private world where only the two of them existed. "Grace," he said softly, "I'm not good with fancy words, but these past weeks, getting to know you, it's changed something in me." Her heart hammered in her chest as he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've spent years believing the frontier was no place for tenderness, that showing attachment out here was a weakness, but knowing you has made me question that." "Vincent," she whispered, scarcely believing what she was hearing from this man, who had seemed the embodiment of frontier stoicism when they first met. "I'm not asking for promises," he hastened to add. "I know you came west with different plans, but I needed you to know that you've become important to me, more important than I thought anyone could be." The simple honesty of his declaration touched Grace more deeply than any elaborate profession could have. Without overthinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss lasted only a moment, but in that brief connection, something fundamental shifted between them. When they separated, Vincent looked at her with wonder, as though seeing something precious and unexpected. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "before Mrs. Haywood comes looking for you." Grace nodded, suddenly shy. "Thank you for today, all of it." With a last lingering look, Vincent stepped back into the rain, mounted his horse, and rode away. Grace watched until he disappeared into the stormy twilight, her fingers touching her lips where the memory of their kiss still lingered. Inside her room, she moved to the small desk where she kept her personal correspondence. For months, she had been setting aside money for her return east, writing to former acquaintances about potential teaching positions in Boston or Philadelphia. Now she stared at those half-finished letters, seeing them as artifacts from a life she no longer wanted. Wyoming Territory was still harsh, still dangerous. Larson had been a timely reminder of that reality. But it also contained unexpected beauty, genuine community, and the possibility of a love more authentic than anything she had known before. For the first time since arriving, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future here, not as a temporary visitor but as a woman who had found her place. With sudden decision, she gathered the letters and tossed them into the small stove in the corner of her room. As they caught fire and curled into ash, Grace felt not loss but liberation. Whatever happened between her and Vincent, whatever challenges the frontier might still present, she was no longer merely enduring Wyoming, she was choosing it. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship that neither tried to hide from the town's watchful eyes. Vincent called formally at the boarding house, took Grace on proper drives in the ranch wagon, and escorted her to community events. They were becoming a recognized couple, much to the delight of Mrs. Richards and the other ranch wives who had long hoped to see the serious foreman find happiness. Not everyone approved, of course. Several town matrons made pointed remarks about the unsuitability of a refined schoolteacher associating with a cowboy, while a few of the eligible men who had hoped to court Grace themselves spread thinly veiled insults about Vincent's humble background. Most hurtful were the occasional comparisons to her failed engagement to Edgar Harrison, suggestions that she was merely settling for Vincent out of desperation after being abandoned. Grace weathered these comments with outward dignity, though each barb stung. Vincent, when he heard of them, offered to confront the gossipers, but Grace dissuaded him. "Their opinions matter far less to me than they once did," she assured him. "Besides, actions speak louder than words. They'll see the truth in time." July brought preparations for Whispering Pines' Independence Day celebration, an event that would draw people from miles around for a day of feasting, games, dancing, and fireworks. As schoolteacher, Grace was deeply involved in organizing children's activities and helping decorate the town square. 2 days before the celebration, Vincent rode into town looking troubled. He found Grace arranging bunting on the gazebo in the square. "May I speak with you?" he asked, his serious tone immediately capturing her attention. They walked to a quiet corner of the square, away from curious ears. Once they were alone, Vincent wasted no time with preambles. "Larson and his men were in town last night," he said, his expression grim. "They got drunk at the saloon and started talking freely. Thompson heard them planning something for the Independence Day celebration." Grace frowned. "What kind of something?" "They weren't specific, but it involves waiting until everyone's distracted by the fireworks. Thompson thinks they're planning to rob the bank while the town's attention is elsewhere." "Have you told Sheriff Miller?" Vincent nodded. "This morning. He said he'd keep an eye out, but without more concrete evidence, there's not much he can do. Larson's careful. He wouldn't have openly discussed details where he could be overheard." Grace considered this troubling information. "So what will happen?" "Miller's organizing extra deputies for the celebration, and I've arranged for some of the R boys to be in town, keeping watch. But I wanted you to be aware, stay alert during the festivities." The concern in his eyes touched her. "I'll be careful," she promised, "but surely they wouldn't try anything with the entire town gathered." "That's exactly why they would," Vincent countered. "Maximum confusion, minimal resistance, classic outlaw strategy." The celebration day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for outdoor festivities. By mid-morning, the town square was filled with people from Whispering Pines and surrounding homesteads. Bunting and flags decorated every building, tables groaned under the weight of food brought by town ladies, and children ran excitedly between game booths. Grace spent the morning supervising sack races and egg and spoon relays for her students, occasionally catching glimpses of Vincent as he moved through the crowd, vigilant despite the festive atmosphere. Several other R cowboys were similarly positioned around the square, their casual poses belied by watchful eyes. By late afternoon, Grace was finally free to enjoy the celebration herself. She found Vincent near the lemonade stand, his posture relaxing slightly when he saw her. "Having fun?" he asked, offering her a cup of lemonade. "It's wonderful to see everyone enjoying themselves," she replied, gratefully accepting the cool drink. "Any sign of trouble?" Vincent shook his head. "Larson and his men are here, but they've been behaving themselves." Maybe Thompson misunderstood. As evening approached, tables were cleared to make space for dancing. Lanterns were lit around the square, creating a magical atmosphere as a small band began playing. Vincent led Grace onto the improvised dance floor, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly as they moved together. Grace smiled up at him, heart full. She had worn her best dress for the occasion, a deep blue that brought out her eyes with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look quite handsome yourself." As they danced, Grace realized how completely her feelings for this man had transformed her plans and perceptions. The Wyoming Territory that had once seemed merely a harsh stopping point on her journey had become home, largely because of the man holding her now. The future she had once imagined back east paled in comparison to the possibilities she saw when she looked into Vincent's eyes. The band shifted to a slower tune and Vincent drew her slightly closer. "Grace," he began, his voice low and serious, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." A sudden commotion from the direction of the bank interrupted him. Shouts erupted, followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot. Vincent immediately pushed Grace behind him, hand going to his revolver. "Stay here," he ordered, eyes scanning the crowd that had frozen at the sound of gunfire. Before he could move, 3 mounted men burst into the square from a side street, bandanas covering their faces, guns drawn. Grace recognized Larson's distinctive gray stallion even with the rider's face concealed. "Nobody move," Larson shouted. "This doesn't concern most of you." Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his own gun drawn. "Drop your weapons, Larson, you're surrounded." It was true, the R cowboys and Miller's deputies had moved into position around the square, guns trained on the outlaws. But Larson merely laughed. "Maybe so, Sheriff, but we've got something you want." He gestured, and a 4th rider emerged from the shadows, dragging a struggling figure, young Jimmy Wilson, the blacksmith's 10-year-old son. "Jimmy," Grace gasped, instinctively starting forward before Vincent's arm stopped her. "Let the boy go," Miller demanded. "This is between us." "Sure thing," Larson replied easily, "once we're safely out of town with our withdrawals from the bank, otherwise the kid comes with us." The standoff was interrupted by Mrs. Wilson's anguished cry as she pushed through the crowd, only to be restrained by her husband. The tension in the square was palpable as Miller weighed his options. "Let them go," he finally ordered his deputies. "We'll track them once the boy is safe." Vincent's face hardened. "They'll kill him anyway once they're clear," he muttered to Grace. "Larson doesn't leave witnesses." As the outlaws began backing their horses toward the edge of town, Jimmy still struggling in his captor's grip, Grace made a split-second decision. Breaking away from Vincent, she stepped into the open space between the townspeople and the outlaws. "Mr. Larson," she called clearly, "take me instead." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Vincent moved to pull her back, but Grace stood her ground, eyes fixed on Larson. "The boy is too much trouble, he'll slow you down," she continued steadily. "I'll come quietly if you release him." Larson studied her, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The schoolteacher," he said, pulling down his bandana with a smirk. "Aren't you the brave one?" "Grace, no," Vincent said urgently beside her, but Grace kept her focus on Larson. "A simple exchange," she insisted. "The boy goes free, I go with you as insurance until you're safely away." Larson considered for a moment, then nodded. "Deal, send the kid over." "Release him first," Grace demanded. With a shrug, Larson gestured to his man, who roughly pushed Jimmy from the horse. The boy stumbled, then ran toward his parents, sobbing. "Your turn, schoolteacher," Larson called. Grace turned to Vincent, whose face was a mask of anguish and fury. "I'll be all right," she whispered. "They need a hostage alive." "I'll find you," Vincent promised, his voice raw, "wherever they take you." Before he could say more, one of Larson's men rode forward, extending a hand to Grace. With a last look at Vincent, she allowed herself to be pulled onto the horse behind the outlaw. "Nobody follows for 1 hour," Larson shouted as they wheeled their horses around. "Or the lady teacher gets worse than a grammar lesson." With that, they galloped away from town, Grace clinging to the saddle as they rode into the gathering darkness, the sounds of Independence Day celebration fading behind them. The outlaws rode hard for nearly an hour, following a winding path through hills and valleys that Grace suspected was meant to confuse any pursuers. Finally, they reached a small cabin nestled in a grove of pines, well hidden from any main trails. "Home sweet home," Larson announced mockingly as they dismounted, "at least for tonight." Grace was escorted roughly into the cabin, which contained only minimal furniture, a table, a few chairs, and bedrolls spread in one corner. The air smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed men. "Sit," Larson ordered, pointing to a chair. As Grace complied, he turned to his men. "Johnson, take first watch. Peters, see to the horses. Miller, get a fire going." With the men occupied, Larson turned his attention back to Grace. "Brave thing you did back there, schoolteacher. Stupid, but brave." "The boy is 10 years old," Grace replied evenly. "He didn't deserve to be terrorized." Larson chuckled. "And you think you do?" "I made my choice." Something like reluctant respect flickered in Larson's eyes. "That you did." He pulled up another chair, sitting across from her. "You know, your cowboy's going to come looking for you." "I expect he will," Grace acknowledged, refusing to show fear. "Good," Larson said with a cold smile. "I've been wanting to settle matters with Dawson for some time now. Thanks to you, I'll get my chance." The implication was clear. Vincent was riding into a trap. Grace kept her expression neutral despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "If your quarrel is with Mr. Dawson, why involve the town? The bank robbery, taking a child hostage, those were unnecessary." Larson leaned back in his chair. "Business, schoolteacher, a man's got to make a living. The personal score with Dawson is just a bonus." One of the men returned with an armload of firewood. "Boss, we're almost out of supplies. That last job didn't leave us time to stock up." Larson frowned, checked the saddlebags. "We grabbed some food from the celebration before all hell broke loose." As the outlaws busied themselves with building a fire and inventorying their meager supplies, Grace took stock of her surroundings. The cabin had only one door but 2 small windows. 3 men plus Larson, all armed. Her chances of escape seemed slim, but she was determined to find a way not just for herself but to warn Vincent about the trap. The hours crawled by. Grace was given water but declined the food offered, her stomach too knotted with tension to eat. As the night deepened, the outlaws took turns keeping watch while the others dozed. Larson himself seemed too keyed up to sleep, pacing the small cabin and occasionally peering out the window into the darkness. Around midnight, Grace was startled by a low whistle from outside. Larson immediately tensed, drawing his gun. "That's Peter's signal," he told his men quietly. "Someone's coming, get ready." Grace's heart raced as the outlaws positioned themselves. One by the window, one behind the door, Larson across the room with a clear shot at anyone entering. The 4th man remained outside as their lookout. "Not a sound," Larson warned Grace, his gun now pointed directly at her. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for, hoofbeats approaching slowly, cautiously. "Just one rider," whispered the man at the window. Larson smiled coldly. "Dawson, right on schedule." The hoofbeats stopped some distance from the cabin. Silence fell again, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying fire. Grace strained to hear any movement outside, wondering what Vincent was planning. Suddenly, a shot rang out from somewhere in the darkness, followed by a cry of pain. Peters, the lookout. The outlaws exchanged alarmed glances as more gunfire erupted outside. "There's more than one," Johnson hissed, ducking away from the window. "We're surrounded." Larson's face contorted with rage. "Damn him." He brought reinforcements. He grabbed Grace roughly by the arm, pulling her to her feet. Looks like your cowboy's smarter than I gave him credit for. A voice called from outside, not Vincent's but Sheriff Miller's. Larson. You're surrounded by deputies and Triple R men. Send out the schoolteacher and throw down your weapons. Larson's grip on Grace's arm tightened painfully. Not happening, Sheriff, he shouted back. You back off or the lady dies. You kill her, you'll never leave this cabin alive, came the reply. Think smart, Larson, this doesn't have to end badly for anyone. The standoff stretched for several tense minutes. Grace could feel Larson's desperation growing as he realized the trap he'd set had been turned against him. His men looked to him for direction, clearly uncertain about their chances. Boss, maybe we should, Johnson began, only to be silenced by Larson's glare. I'm not going to prison, Larson snarled. He turned his attention back to Grace. Where's Dawson? Why isn't he out there making demands? Before Grace could answer, a soft thud came from the roof. All eyes turned upward just as a small object dropped through the chimney and landed in the dying embers of the fire. Smoke immediately began billowing out, not from the fire but from the object itself. Smoke bomb, Miller yelled, lunging for it, but it was too late. Thick, acrid smoke rapidly filled the small cabin, making breathing difficult and visibility impossible within seconds. In the confusion, Grace felt Larson's grip loosen. She pulled away, dropping to the floor where the air was slightly clearer. Gunfire erupted again outside, and someone kicked in the cabin door. More shots rang out within the cabin itself, accompanied by shouts and the sounds of struggle. Disoriented by the smoke, Grace crawled toward where she thought the door might be. A hand suddenly grabbed her shoulder and she struck out instinctively. Grace, it's me, Vincent's voice barely audible over the chaos. Relief flooded through her as his arms encircled her, lifting her from the floor. He pressed a damp bandana to her face. Breathe through this, we're getting out. Vincent half-carried her through the smoke-filled cabin and out into the cool night air. Once outside, Grace gulped in deep breaths, coughing as her lungs cleared. Are you hurt? Vincent demanded, his hands gently examining her face in the moonlight, eyes intense with concern. No, she managed between coughs. I'm all right. Only then did she take in the scene around them. Several Triple R cowboys and deputies had Larson's men subdued on the ground. Sheriff Miller was approaching, looking grimly satisfied. Larson? Vincent asked him. Took a bullet in the shoulder, Miller replied. He'll live to stand trial. Good plan with the smoke, Dawson. Vincent nodded acknowledgement but kept his attention on Grace. I thought I'd lost you, he said quietly for her ears alone. When I saw them take you. Grace reached up to touch his face, noting for the first time the dirt and soot streaking his features, the raw desperation still evident in his eyes. I knew you would come. Always, he promised simply. As the outlaws were secured for transport back to town, Vincent wrapped a blanket around Grace's shoulders and led her to his horse. Let's get you home. The ride back to Whispering Pines was slow and careful, Grace seated in front of Vincent on his horse, his arms around her as he held the reins. They spoke little, both processing the night's events in exhausted silence. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn when they reached town. A small crowd had gathered in the square despite the early hour. News of the hostage situation and rescue attempt had spread quickly. When they saw Grace returning safely with Vincent, a cheer went up, quickly followed by a flurry of questions and exclamations. Mrs. Haywood pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Grace. My dear girl. We've been so worried. I'm fine, Grace assured her, though her voice was hoarse from the smoke, thanks to Vincent and the others. The town doctor insisted on examining her, pronouncing her suffering from nothing worse than smoke inhalation and minor bruising. As the excitement died down and people began dispersing, Vincent remained at her side, a steady, protective presence. Finally, as Grace prepared to return to her room for much-needed rest, Vincent took her hand, drawing her slightly away from the remaining onlookers. Before everything happened yesterday, he said, his voice low and intense, I was about to ask you something important. Grace's heart quickened despite her exhaustion. Yes. The last few months have changed me, Grace. Changed how I see the frontier, how I see my future. He took a deep breath. I've spent years believing that love was a luxury a man couldn't afford out here, that attachments were dangerous, vulnerability a weakness. You've shown me how wrong I was. He took both her hands in his. I love you, Grace Everett. I want to build a life with you, not back east, not somewhere safer, but right here in Wyoming Territory, because anywhere you are is home to me now. Tears filled Grace's eyes as Vincent continued. I know it's not what you planned when you came west. I know the frontier is harsh and sometimes dangerous, but I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes if you'll have me. His voice roughened with emotion. Will you marry me, Grace? The question hung between them in the early morning light, filled with all the promise and uncertainty of frontier life itself. Grace thought of the girl who had arrived in Wyoming Territory, convinced it was merely a temporary stop on her journey elsewhere. How different she was now, stronger, braver, more willing to embrace the unpredictability of life instead of hiding from it. Yes, she said simply, joy breaking through her exhaustion like sunrise through clouds. Yes, I will marry you, Vincent. His smile was brilliant as he pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of her bruises. Their kiss was a promise of partnership, of a shared future, of love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the frontier might bring. 3 weeks later, the church in Whispering Pines was filled once again for a wedding. This time, however, the bride walked down the aisle with absolute certainty, her blue eyes fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar. Grace Everett wore a simple white dress adorned with lace from her original wedding gown, now redesigned by Mrs. Richards' skilled hands. Her golden hair was crowned with wildflowers gathered that morning from the Triple R meadows. As she moved forward, she passed pews filled not with curious onlookers but with people who had become true friends, townsfolk and ranch hands alike who had witnessed her transformation from reluctant visitor to woman of the frontier. Vincent Dawson stood tall and proud, cleaned up but still unmistakably a cowboy in his best suit, his hat respectfully held in his hands. His eyes never left Grace as she approached, his expression holding a wonder that touched everyone who saw it. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows exchanged with clear voices that carried to every corner of the small church. When the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one witness's eyes. The celebration afterward sprawled across the town square, everyone contributing food, music, and high spirits. As afternoon faded toward evening, Vincent led Grace away from the festivities toward a waiting wagon. One more surprise, he said with a smile, helping her up to the seat beside him. They rode a short distance from town, following the creek that wound through Triple R land. As they crested a small hill, Grace gasped at what waited below, a cabin, newly built, smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. "Welcome home," Vincent said softly, "if you approve, Mr. Richards gave us this parcel as a wedding gift, close enough to town for your teaching, close enough to the main ranch house for my work." Grace took in the sturdy cabin with its wide porch, the corral for horses, the garden plot already turned for planting. It wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was solid, practical, and built with evident care. "It's perfect," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Later, as they stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Vincent's arm warm around her waist, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come west believing the frontier was merely a harsh way station, too wild and dangerous for lasting happiness. She had planned to bring Eastern civilization to the wilderness, never imagining the wilderness might instead teach her about courage, authenticity, and love. "What are you thinking?" Vincent asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Grace leaned into his embrace, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I'm thinking about how differently things turned out from what I expected. How being abandoned at that altar led me to find something truer than I ever imagined possible." Vincent turned her gently in his arms, his expression serious. "I can't promise the frontier will always be kind, Grace. There will be hard winters, dry summers, challenges we can't foresee." "I know," she replied, "but we'll face them together, that makes all the difference." His smile returned, tender and certain. Together, he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as night settled over their Wyoming home. The schoolteacher who had once counted the days until she could return east had found unexpected happiness in the arms of a Wyoming cowboy, not despite the frontier's hardships but partly because of them. The very wildness that had once frightened her had helped forge a love stronger and more genuine than anything she could have found in the drawing rooms of Boston. Grace Dawson had come home at last, not to the safety of civilization, but to the honest embrace of the frontier and the man who had shown her its true heart.